Thank you, Liam. Motor vehicle recalls are certainly nothing new. In fact, they're more common than you can even imagine. Sometimes the big recall isn't a big deal, but there are definitely cases where the problem can be deadly. Take, for instance, General Motors. The company has just agreed to pay $900 million to settle hundreds of lawsuits over faulty car ignition switches. The switches, which can slip out of the run position and cut off the engine, have been linked to more than 120 deaths. So what do you do if you get a recall notice in the mail? Personal injury lawyer John Philp of Preszler Law is here to answer those questions. Good morning.
Good morning.
And we're not talking about Volkswagen in this particular situation because that has not proved to cause injury to anyone.
Correct, yeah. I mean, the GM situation is much different than Volkswagen. And I think it's important that you differentiate what's happening in the U.S. with Canada. I mean, the settlement that GM reached deals with class action lawsuits and federal violations in the United States, not Canada. So there's a big difference in terms of how recalls are affected in Canada versus the U.S. And in Canada, it's going to surprise, I think, a lot of your viewers that Transport Canada actually doesn't have the teeth to legally force a manufacturer to issue a recall. They can ask the manufacturer to notify consumers of the defect, but Transport Canada can't actually force a recall in circumstances where a defect may cause injury.
So when we hear of those happening, then it's because the manufacturer themselves have discovered it and decided to make that recall because, you know, if people are hurt.
Yeah. In Canada, it's very Canadian of us. It's a voluntary recall system in Canada for auto manufacturers. And, you know, it also may surprise your viewers to know that even if you receive one of these notifications of defect in the mail, you go to the dealership, legally, that dealership and the manufacturer are not legally required to pay for that repair. But what happens most of the time, just for consumer relations, they will pay for it.
Okay, so what happens if you do get a recall notice in the mail? What should you do?
Well, Liza, this may sound really trite, but deal with it.
Yeah.
Most people, I think, they receive one of these notifications in the mail and it will sit on the shelf for 3-4 months before they say, oh geez, I never dealt with that. Very important to deal with these situations, especially if the defect deals with perhaps an airbag defect, or in the case of GM, the ignition switch situation where the vehicle would just suddenly shut off. This puts yourself and your family into a significant risk situation, and you really should deal with them very quickly.
If heaven forbid you get the notice, you don't do anything about it, and then you have a problem, I would suspect if that happened and then someone comes to you and says, you know, I crashed my car, people were hurt, if you've had the notice already, you're probably not going to go very far.
Well, you know, we've talked about this. For any lawsuit, it's what happens in the particular circumstances. So if you've received a defect notice and that defect ultimately does cause you injury in a motor vehicle accident, that's going to factor into what we call contributory negligence. So you had notice of this defect, yet you did nothing about it. It may not necessarily completely bar you from pursuing a lawsuit, but it definitely will factor into it as a consideration.
That's unbelievable. So if you are injured in a motor vehicle accident because of a parts defect, you contact who contacts the manufacturer? Well,
you'd pursue a number of parties, I think. You'd have to pursue legally the manufacturer. You'd pursue potentially the dealership that sold you the vehicle. It gets a little more tricky when it's a used vehicle, because if it's a used vehicle and you never received a notice of defect, you could potentially go after the previous owner of that vehicle. You could go after the garage that safetied the vehicle for you when you purchased it used, because arguably they should be checking if there's notifications of defect for that particular vehicle.
All right, very good. John Philp from Preszler Law, thank you.
Thank you.
If you have any personal injury questions for John and his team at Preszler Law, visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/morningshowto. Here's a look at traffic now. Hi, Kim.